Alright guys, we're back for section 3, Encountering the Mongols, comparing 3 cases. This section is very important because if you'll remember from the first few chapters in part 3, chapters especially 7, 8, 9, well, and even chapter 10 actually, there was a big focus on other religions like the development of Judaism and Zoroastrianism, and then Christianity, and then a full chapter devoted to the rise of Islam. Learning about the Mongols is very important, not just looking at the history of pastoral nomads and the Mongol Empire itself, but it's important to compare the Mongols in the 3 different, really distinctly different locations of some of their conquered peoples. The Mongol conquest in Baghdad in 1258 ended the age of expansive Arab Islamic empires. And remember, we learned about an entire millennia where the Arab Empire was the strongest, the most advanced, and continually spreading the religion of Islam mainly through trade. But that ended when the Mongols conquered Baghdad in 1258. The Islamic empires no longer dominated the non-Arab states. And that included the successors of the Central Asian conquerors who did convert to Islam. It's important for you guys to understand how connections with Central Asia influenced great shifts in the Islamic world. Okay, China and the Mongols. The Mongol conquest of China was rather difficult. It took from 1209 to 1279. And that's 70 years of conquest. China was the main target of the Mongols. And in 1209, Genghis Khan launched an attack on this wealthy and prosperous region. And after a series of campaigns lasting 7 decades, the Mongols were finally victorious. While the Mongols were brutal and destructive in the north of China, they were much more accommodating in the south. And so they began in the north, and those were ruled by dynasties that actually were from nomadic origin, but vastly destructive. And the conquest of southern China, which at the time was ruled by the Sung Dynasty, was far less violent. They were more interested in the accommodation of the local populace, and they even allowed landowners there to keep their estates in return for loyalty and support. And the Mongols actually unified a divided China. Many believe that the Mongols had been granted the mandate of heaven, and the Mongols didn't know how to govern an agricultural society, so many of them used previous Chinese practices. And they gave themselves the Chinese dynastic title, the Yuan, which means great beginnings. And they built a new capital, Kongbalik, the city of the Khan, which is now present-day Beijing. Let's look at the Yuan Dynasty and Kubla Kahn. The Mongols did adopt some aspects of Chinese statecraft in order to rule the region more effectively and withdraw as much wealth as possible. It went so far as to establish this Chinese-style dynasty. And Kublai Khan, who is the grandson of Genghis Khan, he became the emperor. He listened to the counsel of his favorite wife and adopted policies that encouraged agricultural production that the Chinese were already accustomed to in order to generate even more wealth. And the Mongols adopted some aspects of Chinese ancestor veneration. They built roads, canals, and other forms of infrastructure to promote commerce. So they did a lot of good things in China, despite how destructive the conquests were. They adopted some Chinese aspects, especially the dynastic style and the bureaucratic system, and did some other things. Like I said, they built roads and canals and did a lot to promote trade. Now, Kubla Khan, he had a set of ancestral tablets made, and he even undertook some policies that evoked the values of a benevolent Chinese emperor. So, despite how destructive the conquests were, he was seen as a benevolent emperor. This region during this time was very prosperous, very wealthy. And however, Mongol rule and occupation to the Chinese was seen as harsh and exploitative, and even foreign. The Mongols did try to accommodate their Chinese subjects, but they were foreign occupiers, and they were there to extract as much wealth as possible. And the Chinese even resented the Mongols. The Mongols' disregard of the exam system and their reliance on foreigners such as Muslims from Central Asia and even the Middle East to administer the empire really upset many of the Chinese. So even though they adopted many of those Chinese methods of the bureaucracy and administrative systems, they didn't use Chinese to run those systems. The Mongol elite kept many of their traditional practices. They slept in tents, even when they were in the capital. They didn't become Chinese. Very few of them even learned the Chinese language. The Forbidden City that was in the capital was set up like the steppes, and they relied heavily on those foreigners for administration, those from the Middle East and Central Asia, as opposed to the traditional administrative system. And even Mongol law that was developed discriminated against the Chinese. And by Chinese standards, women were shockingly free, because remember, it's a nomadic, a pastoral group. They're more egalitarian than agricultural societies, and so that was shocking to many of the Chinese. And eventually, by 1368, rebellions had forced the Mongols out of China. And this is what, after the collapse of the Yuan Dynasty, this is what led to the Ming Dynasty. Factionalism among the Mongols, rising prices, even a series of natural disasters really weakened their hold on power and allowed some space for rebels to come in and challenge their authority. So the Yuan Dynasty was overthrown in 1368, and the new Ming Dynasty sought to eliminate the memory of the Mongols in China. All right, Persia and the Mongols. The conquest of Persia, the first invasion was led by Genghis Khan, about 1219, 1221. And the second assault was attempted successful under his grandson, Hulagu, in 1251 and 1258. These two brutal attacks just completely brought down the Persian Empire, and obviously fell much faster than China. These attacks were much more intense and devastating than earlier assaults from the Turkic invaders, and they were more psychologically devastating because, unlike the Turks, who were Muslims, the Mongols were not Muslims, and they were seen as barbaric, pagans or pagan barbarians, infidels. And so it wasn't just damaging physically and demographically, but it was damaging psychologically as well for those that survived. And even in some locations in the Persian Empire, the Mongols completely wiped out towns where there were no survivors. And that's different from how they conquered before. And this was a big damage to agriculture, which is what the Persian Empire relied on. And out of lack of respect of agriculture, and because of the damage caused by the Mongols herds, there was serious damage to the region's farmland. And important underground irrigation systems fell apart. This led to desertification in some areas. And so it was rather destructive in many areas. And this really shook the faith of the Muslims because they just couldn't believe how could Muslims who were great, I mean, remember, it was 1,000 years of prosperity in the Arab world, and they were chic and wealthy, and I mean, how could this happen, and it so quickly and so badly? Because when the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, that was the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, the end of the Muslims being in control. So it was profound damage to not just Persian and Iraqi agriculture, but to trade and culture, socially. But there was an increase in wine and silk production. Wine was important for certain levels on certain levels and for certain rituals for the Mongols. And of course, silk production was always important. And along the Silk Roads, as it goes through parts of the Persian Empire, very important. Now, the Mongols were transformed far more in Persia than they were in China. Even though they adopted many Chinese practices, they were still Mongols. They were still foreign. But in Persia, that was completely different. This is like a Persian civilization of barbarian Mongols, if you will. The Persians had a much more significant impact on the Mongols than the Chinese did. The invaders quickly realized the importance and the supremacy of the Persian bureaucracy, and they used it for their own purposes. They also began to rebuild some of those damaged cities and road systems. And when the dynasty fell in the 1330s, the Persians actually did not expel the Mongols like the Chinese did, but they rather assimilated them into the Persian culture. And so the Mongols had an extensive use of the Persian bureaucracy, and then with the, they were far more transformed than their counterparts in China. And with the reign of Hazan, that's this guy right there, Hazan, it was under his reign where they tried to repair some of that earlier damage, like to the agriculture and irrigation systems and roads. And so they made some valiant efforts to repair that damage from the earlier policies of ruthlessness and brutality and exploitation, rebuilding those cities and repairing some of those neglected systems and projects. And most importantly, the Mongol elites, or the Mongols in Persia, converted to Islam on a large scale. And that's probably the most significant impact that the Persian culture had on the Mongols themselves. The Mongols who conquered Persia became Muslims, and that was following the lead of Hazan, who converted to Islam in 1295. And no such widespread conversion to the Mongol culture happened in China or in Russia, but it did in Persia. Some of the Mongol elites even learned Persian languages, and even abandoned their nomadic herding lifestyles and took up agriculture. But eventually the Mongol dynasty collapsed in the 1330s here in Persia, or it used to be the Persian Empire, and the Abbasid Caliphate. Oh, this is a great picture. Think about what this picture shows. It shows the wives of Mongol rulers exercising considerable influence at court. Right, they're very involved. And this is from the 14th century. And it actually shows Genghis Khan's fourth son, Tulai, the ruler of the Mongol heartland, after his father's death after Genghis died. And he had a Christian wife. And after her husband's early death to alcoholism, she maneuvered her children, including Kubla Kahn, right, who became the leader of the Yuan Dynasty, into powerful positions, and strongly encouraged them in the direction of religious toleration. And that's probably, obviously, from her Christian beliefs, is the religious toleration. All right, the Russians and the Mongols. Russia and the Mongols. The Mongols, they devastated Russia. And this took about 3 years, 1237 to 1240. They used technology such as catapults and battering rams that they gained from campaigns in China and Persia. And the invasion of the Kievan Rus was an impressive assault on a very weak and disunited people. The Kievan Rus was made up of several independent principalities with different princes that held control over very small areas. And so they were not united, they were weak, and it was just utter devastation. And it was a rather quick and easily decided assault on the Kievan Rus. And this was the establishment of the Khanate of the Golden Horde. There's no way that they could unite against that Mongol threat to fight them off. And this led to the destruction of cities, widespread slaughter, and even the deportation of skilled workers out of this area. And now the Russians called it the Khanate of the Golden Horde, but this is also what's known as the Kipchak Khanate. But ironically, Russia actually integrated into the Mongol Empire, like I said, as the Kipchak Khanate, but the Mongols didn't occupy Russia. They instead remained on the steppes north of the Black and Caspian Seas, and they just collected tribute and heavy taxes from the Russians, and they also raided for slaves. Right, the word Slavs, slaves. So this is exploitation without occupation. Now, the invasion was impressive and devastated many areas, but the Mongols chose not to occupy. It was a relatively poor and isolated group of people. And instead, they just settled nearby on the steppes and their pastoral lands that they were familiar with, like I said, north of the Black and Caspian Seas. And they put them in this, within striking distance of the cities, but didn't occupy the cities. And they really exploited them for tribute and heavy taxes. And believe it or not, some of the Russian princes and Russian Orthodox Church actually flourished. Moscow became the primary tribute collector for the Mongols. That's obviously, let me fix that, for without the E there. And notice the, right, Moscow, the city here. And the Mongol rulers of Russia were far less assimilated or even influenced. So they weren't, obviously they were heavily influenced by the Persians, and they were influenced by the Chinese because they adopted many of their styles. But the Kievan Rus were so disunited and so weak and so, what's the word I'm looking for? Unsophisticated, that they didn't even assimilate, or they weren't even influenced by the Kievan Rus. So, those that chose to resist, they faced brutal retaliation, like Kiev, for example. But others collaborated. They even helped the Mongols collect tribute, and that's the rise of Moscow. And some of them ended up doing very well for themselves. And so this is where the rise of Moscow and the church come into play. This is the core of a new Russian state that's developing. They adopted Mongol weapons, diplomacy, taxation, their court system. And the Russian Orthodox Church enjoyed Mongol tolerance, right, the religious tolerance, and tax exemption, and it's reached deeper into the countryside. But like I said, the Mongol rulers of Russia were far less assimilated or influenced than any of those other locations. And this is where Moscow, like I said, became the core of the new Russian state. I'm pretty sure I've mentioned it to you guys before, but that Mongol Courier service, those were the posting stations and that communication network where every 25 or so miles there were different posting stations, and you didn't necessarily have to stop and get new, fresh horses and food and rest and everything. Some would travel farther, but but the Russians used that courier service. You've seen the size of Russia. It's huge. And so they needed a way to get information and communicate from one end of the empire to the next. But eventually, the Russians broke free of Mongol rule. The Russians were the last to be conquered by the Mongols and the last to break free of the Mongols. And that happened by the end of the 15th century, by the end of the 1400s. And so you can see it's not, the end of the 1400s is significant, not just because of the discovery of the Americas, but it's really the last, what's going on in the other part of the world in Asia. It's the last hold of the Mongols on a formerly conquered group of people.